The auction house smelled of rust, sweat, and desperation. Flickering neon lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the faces of those gathered. The air was thick with the acrid scent of machinery and the press of too many bodies packed into too little space. The crowd murmured in 100 different dialects, each voice blending into a chaotic hum, underscored by the rhythmic clank of a malfunctioning ventilation system. This was the Obsidian Market, a hidden outpost floating in the vast expanse of deep space, far from the laws of any federation or planetary authority. It was a place where anything and anyone could be bought, for the right price. Traders, bounty hunters, and outlaws filled the stands, eyes glittering as they scanned the merchandise lined up behind shimmering containment barriers. Some were fighters, their muscles flexing beneath worn uniforms. Others were technicians, their wrists scarred from years of delicate cybernetic work. And then there was her. The girl stood apart from the others, her wrists loosely resting on her lap, her ankles shackled but not struggling. She wasn't like the rest. The others tried to appear strong, valuable, some even putting on a show of obedience to entice bidders. She did none of that. She sat with her chin slightly lowered, though not in defeat. Her silver-blue skin shimmered faintly under the dim lights, a sheen that shifted with every subtle movement. Her eyes, deep and dark, reflected the neon above, endless and vast, like the abyss beyond the ship's walls. A faint, pulsing glow traced delicate lines along her wrists, a pattern no one in the room could quite decipher. The traders who had dragged her across the stars had already given up trying to fetch a high price. She was an anomaly, too strange for the corporate labs, too proud for servitude, too fragile for the fighting pits. She had been sold and returned, over and over again. The auctioneer, a broad-shouldered man with a face like weathered leather, exhaled through his nose as he scrolled through his datapad. His sigh was audible over the din of the room. Next up, Lot 9043. The crowd barely stirred. The energy barrier flickered and dropped. A trader shoved her forward, forcing her to take an unsteady step onto the auction platform. The hush that settled over the room was not one of awe, but of vague disinterest. "She's small," someone muttered. "Not small, light," another corrected. "Look at that bone structure. She'd snap in a strong breeze." "What's the color of that skin, even?" a third voice chimed in, skeptical. A ripple of chuckles followed. Behind the auctioneer's podium, one of the traders shrugged when someone in the crowd asked the inevitable question. "Does it talk?" "She's got a mouth, don't she?" the trader responded dryly. Another round of laughter. She exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to roll her eyes. It was always the same. The sneers, the half-hearted bids, the disinterest. Someone would offer a handful of credits, someone else would scoff. And then she'd be hauled off to another station, another owner, another pointless attempt to prove she was worth something to people who only saw value in credits. And then, he spoke. "I'll take her." The voice was sharp, not loud, not aggressive, just casually decisive. A single sentence that sliced through the murmurs like a blade. Heads turned. She turned too, expecting to see another warlord, another merchant looking for something exotic to parade around, another monster hiding behind wealth and power. Instead, she saw a human. He didn't belong here. Not in this crowd. He looked like he'd wandered in by accident, his jacket patched up in places, his boots scuffed and worn from too many miles on too many planets. His dark hair was a mess, sticking out at odd angles like he hadn't bothered with it for days. The stubble on his jaw was uneven, not quite intentional, as if he either couldn't grow a proper beard or just didn't care enough to try. His posture was easy, one hand in his pocket, the other lazily scratching the back of his head. He looked bored. The auctioneer blinked. "You want this one?" The man, Jack, she later learned his name was, nodded once. "Sure." A murmur spread through the crowd. Someone stifled a laugh. The auctioneer, clearly unimpressed, glanced between the datapad and the girl standing before him. "Sir," he started, careful, as if addressing a particularly dim-witted customer. "This one isn't exactly premium stock." Jack squinted at her, as if just now giving her a proper look. "She's breathing, isn't she?" "Well, yes, but..." She got a brain? A pause. The auctioneer hesitated, technically obligated to say yes. I suppose. Jack gave a lopsided grin. Cool. How much? The traders exchanged glances. Someone snorted. You serious? You're actually offering credits for that? Jack shrugged. Listen, you called her worthless, so I'm thinking, how much for something worth nothing? Silence, then laughter. The auctioneer exhaled through his nose and tapped at his datapad. Fine. If you want her that badly, 300 credits. Jack raised a brow. 300? For nothing? The auctioneer groaned. Fine. EQ's Jack's grin widened. 150. A trader sighed, already bored. Just take her. The gavel slammed down. She blinked, her mind struggling to catch up. That was it? Just like that? He'd bought her? The collar around her throat deactivated. The shackles unlocked with a soft hiss. One final shove from the traders sent her stumbling forward, her last unceremonious sale. Jack caught her before she could fall. His grip was firm but not forceful, his fingers warm against her wrist. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then finally, she found her voice. Why? Jack tilted his head. What? She narrowed her eyes. You don't even know what I am. He grinned. I know what you aren't. She hesitated. And what's that? Jack's smile softened. But there was something unreadable behind it. Something that wasn't amusement. Worthless. Her breath caught. She opened her mouth, then closed it. That was new. Jack released her wrist and stepped back, jerking his head toward the exit. Come on, he said, already turning. You look like you could use a drink. She stayed still, watching him, uncertainty churning inside her. There was no collar around her throat, no chains on her wrists. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't being dragged away. She was walking away on her own. And she followed him. Because in that moment, Jack Hunter was the first person in the universe to treat her like she was something more than a transaction. The neon haze of the marketplace was already fading behind them when Celeste stepped onto the ship's loading ramp. The starfire loomed in front of her like a battered relic of a forgotten war. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't impressive, it was barely even space-worthy. The hull was patchwork, covered in mismatched metal plating and scorch marks, as if it had barely survived more than a few encounters with something much bigger and meaner. A low hum of energy pulsed from deep within the ship, uneven, struggling, like it wasn't entirely sure it wanted to keep running. The closer Celeste got, the more she could hear the subtle clicks and whirs of failing components, the faint hiss of a coolant leak somewhere in the underbelly. This ship had seen things, and somehow it was still here. Jack strode up the ramp without hesitation, moving like a man who knew exactly where he was going, but had no particular urgency to get there. Celeste, on the other hand, stopped at the threshold, her feet planted firmly at the top of the loading ramp. She should run, she knew that. She had no idea what this man wanted, what he was after, what kind of deal he was trying to play. He hadn't put restraints on her, hadn't given any orders, hadn't tried to claim anything. But that didn't mean he wouldn't. She had seen enough of the universe to know that nobody did something for nothing. Jack didn't even glance back. You coming, or you planning to just stare at the ship all night? Celeste didn't move. Jack sighed, shaking his head as he hit a control panel beside the ramp. The ship groaned, hydraulics kicking in as the ramp began to rise, sealing off her escape route. Her pulse spiked. Jack caught the movement, his eyes flicking toward her with something like mild amusement. Relax. If you hate it, I'll drop you off at the next station. No one's forcing you to stay. That was what threw her off the most. She had expected chains, orders, threats. She had expected a price for her freedom, because there always was one. She had not expected this. Celeste stepped inside just as the ramp sealed shut behind her. The interior of the Starfire was somehow both exactly what she expected and worse. Exposed wiring ran along the walls, barely held in place with tape and makeshift clamps. The overhead lighting flickered intermittently, throwing jagged shadows against metal bulkheads. The air smelled faintly of old fuel, rust, and something that might have been burnt coffee or a very questionable meal. Jack tossed his jacket onto a chair that looked like it had survived a crash landing or two, then stretched, exhaling like a man who had just finished a long shift at a terrible job. Before Celeste could speak, a voice crackled through unseen speakers. "Oh, fantastic," the voice drawled, heavily laced with sarcasm. "Another stray. How long until this one tries to stab you?" Celeste's shoulders tensed. Jack groaned, rubbing his temple. "Aura. Don't start." "Excuse me," the voice, Aura apparently, snapped. "But I am the one keeping this heap of scrap floating through the void, so I think I have a right to ask. What's wrong with this one?" Celeste narrowed her eyes, her jaw tightening. Jack sighed, gesturing vaguely toward the ceiling. "Aura, meet Celeste. Celeste, meet Aura. She's the ship's AI, and she's got an attitude problem." Aura huffed. "I do not have an attitude problem. I have a very justified sense of self-preservation." Celeste crossed her arms. "I'm standing right here, you know." "Yeah, I noticed. I also noticed that he picked you up for 100 credits, which means you're either a disaster, a death sentence, or..." Aura paused. "Nope. That's basically it. Those are the only options." Celeste clenched her teeth. "Do you always insult your passengers?" "Oh, sweetheart," Aura said with mock sweetness. "You're not a passenger. You're Jack's latest terrible decision." Jack waved a hand dismissively. "Aura likes to think she's funny. Try not to encourage her." Celeste's mind was already racing. A ship AI? Advanced enough to be sarcastic? That wasn't common. And if Jack had access to something like that, it meant he wasn't just some drifter picking up strays at an auction for fun. Jack dropped into the pilot's seat, boots kicked up onto the console, and began flipping switches like he'd done it 1,000 times before. Celeste lingered near the entrance, scanning the ship, mapping exits, weak points, possible weapons. Jack didn't look at her when he spoke next. "You hungry?" Celeste hesitated. "No." "Liar," Aura muttered. Celeste ignored her. Jack smirked. "Suit yourself." He tapped a few controls, and the ship rumbled beneath them, engines firing up with a deep, uneven growl. Celeste took an instinctive step back, muscles tensing. Jack finally looked at her, his gaze sharp, reading her reaction like an open book. "You ever been on a ship before?" Celeste met his eyes. "Yes." "Yeah?" He tilted his head slightly. "As a passenger? Or as cargo?" She didn't answer. Jack's smirk faded. He nodded, more to himself than anything, before focusing back on the controls. "Well," he said casually, "right now, you're neither." The Starfire lurched as it lifted from the docking bay, breaking free from the artificial gravity of the station. Celeste braced herself, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. She was on a ship. No collar, no chains, no orders. Jack could say whatever he wanted, but she wasn't naive. She wasn't a passenger. She wasn't free. Not yet. Hours passed in a tense silence. Celeste didn't sleep. She wasn't sure she could. Jack had disappeared somewhere deeper into the ship, leaving her alone in the cockpit. Aura, thankfully, had stopped talking. The ship drifted through the dark, nothing but stars stretching endlessly in every direction. For the first time in a long time, no one was watching her. She could just exist. But that didn't mean she could trust it. Footsteps behind her. Celeste turned just as Jack dropped into the co-pilot seat, a steaming cup of something in his hand. "Figured you'd still be up," he said, handing her the cup without asking. She stared at it. Jack arched a brow. "It's not poisoned. Probably." Celeste took it hesitantly. The warmth seeped into her fingers, unexpected after so long spent in cold, sterile places. Jack leaned back, watching her carefully. "So," he said, "you gonna try and stab me in my sleep? Or we past that stage?" Celeste exhaled slowly. "I haven't decided yet." Jack grinned. "Good. Keeps things interesting." She sipped the drink. Bitter, slightly burnt, but shockingly normal. She didn't know what this was. She didn't know who he really was. But for the first time in years, no one was treating her like a thing. and that was almost more dangerous than anything else. Celeste sat in silence, the cup warming her hands, her mind racing through too many unanswered questions. Who was this man, really? Why had he taken her? And more importantly, how long before this so-called freedom came with a price? Jack didn't seem like the others she'd encountered before. No threats, no demands, no promises. Just an unbothered, almost reckless ease, like he had no idea what kind of trouble he'd just invited onto his ship. Or worse. Maybe he knew, and didn't care. She was still weighing her options when a sharp chime echoed through the cockpit. Jack muttered a curse under his breath, setting his cup down as he reached for the console. His easygoing expression hardened in an instant. Of course, he sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. Because this was going too well. Aura's voice crackled to life over the ship's comms, far less sarcastic than before. Jack, we've got a problem. Celeste tensed. Jack leaned forward, scanning the incoming data feed on the screen. A soft red glow bathed his face as a new alert scrolled across the display. An encrypted signal. Not just any signal. One from the black market. She didn't need to read the details to know what it meant. They had been tracked. The Revenants, a brutal, highly skilled group of mercenaries, were on their trail. And they wouldn't stop until they got what they came for. Jack let out a long breath and turned toward Celeste, his expression unreadable. Looks like you're a little more popular than I thought. Celeste's fingers clenched around the cup, her heart pounding in her chest. So it had begun. She had escaped the auction. But she wasn't free yet. Not even close. Celeste sat in the cockpit of the Starfire, her thoughts twisted in knots, tangled bet. This was temporary. It had to Jack had bought her, for pocket change, and claim anything from, and that made everything worse. Because if he had, she would have, and instead, she was here, on a ship full of strangers, waiting for the moment this new illusion of freedom shattered. Jack leaned against the control panel, watching her from the corner of his eye. Not questioning, not pushing, just watching. Celeste didn't. Jack exhaled, running a hand through his already. Look, I don't know what kind of trouble you got yourself into, but I know trouble when I see it. And you? He motioned vaguely toward her. You're carrying a whole star system's worth. She turned to face him, arms crossed. Then why bring me here? Jack's lips quirked. Curiosity, poor decision-making. Bit of both. Before Celeste could respond, a gravelly voice cut through the speakers. Come on, Jack. What the hell have you dragged onto my ship this time? Celeste turned just as a figure emerged from the corridor. Tall, broad-shouldered, metal plating replacing one arm up to the shoulder. Rust Morgan. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes flicked over her with sharp calculation, like he was assessing a potential engine malfunction rather than a person. Jack smirked. Rust, meet Celeste. Celeste, meet Rust. He keeps this ship from falling apart, mostly out of spite. Rust folded his arms. And what's your deal, Celeste? Celeste met his gaze unflinching. I don't have a deal. Rust snorted. Yeah? That's funny. 'Cause the last time we picked up someone without a deal, they tried to gut Jack in his sleep. Jack rolled his eyes. That was one time, and I deserved it. Rust wasn't convinced. His gaze shifted back to Celeste, more serious now. Jack, I don't like it, he muttered. You don't know what she is. You don't know who's after her. And if she's worth enough for someone to be tracking her, then she's a problem. Jack shrugged. Probably. Rust's metal fingers curled slightly, the servos whirring. Then maybe we should drop her before she gets us all killed. Celeste's shoulders tensed. She had heard those words before. Jack just grinned like this was all some joke only he was in on. Nah, he said. I kinda like her. Celeste blinked. Rust stared at him like he'd lost his mind. You're serious? Jack shrugged. Rust sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose. She's a problem, Hunter. Jack smirked. So are you. Rust let out a low curse before storming off toward the engine bay, shaking his head. I swear, one day, your recklessness is gonna get this whole damn ship scrapped. When he was gone, Jack turned back to Celeste, his easy smirk still there. See? That went well. Celeste narrowed her eyes. Your crew hates me. Jack waved a hand. Nah, Rust hates everyone. Hours later, Celeste found herself in the Starfire's small, cluttered common area, sitting across from Jack as he tossed a small metal coin between his fingers, deep in thought. Aura's voice crackled over the speakers, sharp and focused. Jack, we have a situation. Jack groaned. I hate those. Aura ignored him. I ran a scan while we were docked at Obsidian. Celeste's genetic markers don't match any known species on record. Celeste stiffened. Jack sat up, interest flickering in his eyes. Come again? Aura's tone didn't waver. Her DNA is unique, uncatalogued, as in she shouldn't exist. Silence. Jack turned to Celeste, eyebrows raised. You got something you want to share with the class? Celeste stared at her hands, at the soft glow along her wrists, pulsing faintly, as if reacting to the words. I don't know what I am, she said finally, voice quiet. But I know one thing. I don't want to be controlled. Jack didn't say anything right away. Then he leaned back, tossing the coin into the air before catching it again. Well, he said casually. That makes two of us. Celeste blinked, caught off guard by the lack of fear, of suspicion, of greed. He wasn't looking at her like she was a puzzle to solve. He was looking at her like she was just a person, and for some reason, that was harder to process than anything else. The moment shattered when Aura spoke again. Jack, we have another problem. Jack groaned. Aura, I swear. Signal incoming, Aura cut in. Encrypted. It's the Revenants. Celeste's breath hitched. Jack sat forward, all humor gone. They found us? Not yet, Aura said. But they will. Nathan Cole is already looking. Celeste's hands curled into fists. Jack noticed. Friend of yours? He asked. Celeste forced herself to breathe. Not even close. Jack nodded slowly, processing. Then, as if it was the simplest thing in the world, he turned back to Aura. All right, let's not be here when they show up. Celeste stared at him, trying to find some sign of hesitation, some sign that he was calculating his options. But there was none. He wasn't even thinking about it. She had been hunted, sold, discarded by everyone who decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Jack had every reason to do the same. And yet, he didn't. Why? She found herself asking. Jack glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Because I don't like being told what to do either. And that was that. The ship rumbled as the engines fired up, pushing them toward the stars. Celeste had spent her entire life trying to survive alone. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to anymore. Not yet, but someday. Celeste had seen fear before. She had seen it in the eyes of those caged beside her. Those who had already given up. Whose will had been broken long before the auction block. She had seen it in the way people flinched at their captors. In the quiet, resigned silence of those who knew their fate was no longer their own. But she had never seen Jack Hunter afraid. Not until now. The ship's cockpit was bathed in the cold glow of warning lights as Aura's voice crackled over the comms. They're coming. Jack's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, hands gripping the controls, his usual carefree air stripped away like a discarded mask. How many? Aura hesitated. Enough. Celeste didn't need details. She already knew what that meant. The Revenants weren't just some back-alley bounty hunters looking to make a quick credit. They were a force, a specialized, highly trained unit that never stopped hunting once they had a target. And now, they were hunting her. Jack muttered a curse under his breath and slammed a fist against the console. Rust Morgan entered the cockpit a moment later, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his cybernetic arm whirring softly as he flexed his fingers. Tell me I'm dreaming, he grumbled. Jack shot him a sharp look. If you were dreaming, I wouldn't be dealing with this alone. Rust let out a low groan, stepping up beside Jack. His gaze flicked toward the incoming sensor data, his usual gruff demeanor turning deadly serious. "That's not a bounty squad," he muttered. "That's a damn strike team." Celeste clenched her hands into fists. "They won't stop." Jack turned to her, expression unreadable. "You sure about that?" She met his gaze, steady despite the weight pressing against her chest. "I've seen them in action." Jack exhaled through his nose, staring at her like he was trying to put together a puzzle with missing pieces. "Then I think it's about time you tell me why you're worth all this trouble." Celeste hesitated. Jack wasn't wrong to ask. She had no reason to expect him to fight for her, not when he barely knew her, not when she had given him no answers, no explanations, nothing to justify why he should be risking his life. But some part of her, the part that had been alone for far too long, wanted to believe that he already knew the answer. That maybe, for once, someone wasn't doing this because of what she was. Maybe he was doing this because of who she was. "I don't know why I exist," she said finally. "But I know I don't want to be their weapon." Jack studied her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned back to the controls and pushed the throttle forward. The Starfire lurched into motion, engines roaring to life as the ship shot forward through the void. Aura's voice crackled over the comms. "We have a problem." Jack let out an exasperated sigh. "Of course we do." "The Revenants aren't just tracking us," Aura continued. "They're locking on." Celeste's breath hitched. Jack's grip on the controls tightened. "Shields up!" Rust barked, moving to the weapons station. "Already on it," AURA replied. A warning alarm blared through the ship. "They're firing," AURA confirmed. Jack reacted instantly, yanking the controls hard to the right. The Starfire rolled sharply, dodging the first blast just as it streaked past, a brilliant flash of energy narrowly missing their left engine. Celeste gripped the edge of her seat, knuckles white. Rust cursed, his fingers flying across the weapons panel. "Jack, we can't outrun them in a straight fight," Rust shouted. Jack gritted his teeth. "Then let's not make it straight." He slammed the thrusters, and the ship dove into a sharp, spiraling descent, weaving through the debris of a nearby asteroid field. Celeste's stomach flipped. The ship rattled violently, metal groaning under the strain, but Jack didn't slow. His expression was focused, sharp in a way that told her he wasn't just some reckless pilot. He knew exactly what he was doing. But the Revenants weren't amateurs. "They're matching our trajectory," Aura warned. "They're closing in." Rust swore under his breath. Jack glanced toward Celeste. "All right, mystery girl. You got any tricks up your sleeve, or are we just winging this?" Celeste's pulse pounded in her ears. She had never used her power willingly. Not in a way that mattered, not in a way that meant anything. She didn't even know if she could control it, but she knew one thing. She was done being hunted. Celeste closed her eyes. She focused. The familiar energy within her stirred, shifting beneath her skin like static electricity waiting to be released. And then, the ship shuddered violently. A burst of blinding white light erupted from Celeste's hands, crackling through the cockpit like a current of raw energy. The monitors flickered, static overtaking the controls for a brief second. Then silence. The alarm stopped. The sensor readings went blank. Celeste opened her eyes, chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Jack stared at the console, eyes wide. Rust let out a low whistle. "What the hell did she just do?" Aura's voice for once was speechless. Jack exhaled, running a hand down his face. "Well," he muttered, "that's new." Celeste's hands trembled as she looked down at them. She had stopped the signal, blocked it. For the first time in her life, her power hadn't hurt anyone. She had used it to protect. Jack leaned back in his seat, letting out a short laugh. "Guess we just leveled the playing field." Celeste met his gaze, a flicker of something foreign in her chest. Hope. For the first time, she wasn't just running. She was fighting back, and she wasn't doing it alone. The Starfire drifted through space, silent except for the faint hum of its overworked engines. Celeste stood near the viewport, watching the distant asteroid belt ahead, the remnants of her power still tingling in her fingertips. She had stopped their pursuers, at least for now. But it didn't feel like a victory. Her body was still shaking. muscles sore from the raw energy she had unleashed. She had no idea how she had done it, or if she could do it again. Behind her, Jack sat slouched in the pilot's seat, boots propped up on the console, watching her carefully. Not afraid, not wary, just watching. "You look like you're about to pass out," he said. Celeste didn't answer. Jack sighed, stretching before standing up. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the hallway. "You need to rest." "I'm fine." Jack gave her a pointed look. "That's a lie." Celeste exhaled sharply, but when she turned to argue, the exhaustion caught up to her all at once. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her. Jack was already moving before she could fall. He caught her by the arm, steadying her with an ease that made it clear this wasn't the first time he had stopped someone from collapsing. "Yeah, see? That's what happens when you nearly fry an entire ship's systems with whatever the hell you just did." Celeste stiffened at his grip, but didn't pull away. Jack studied her for a second longer, then nodded toward the hallway. "Come on. You're getting some rest whether you like it or not." For once, Celeste didn't argue. The Starfire's medbay was small, barely more than a repurposed storage room with a few outdated medical scanners and a cot shoved into the corner. Rust was already waiting, arms crossed, his usual scowl firmly in place. Jack steered Celeste toward the cot, ignoring Rust's glare. "She nearly collapsed," Jack said. "Do your thing." Rust snorted. "You're just full of problems, aren't you?" Celeste didn't have the energy to snap back. She let herself sit, her breathing still uneven. Rust sighed, running a quick scan with the handheld medical reader. "Well, you're not dying, so that's something." Celeste closed her eyes for a moment. "Good to know." Rust set the scanner down and eyed Jack. "You sure about this?" Jack leaned against the doorway. "Pretty sure." Rust huffed, clearly unimpressed with that answer. "You do realize she's dangerous, right?" Rust said, keeping his voice low, but Celeste still heard it. "I mean, whatever she did back there—" "She stopped the signal," Jack interrupted. Rust narrowed his eyes. "And how do we know she won't take the whole damn ship down with her next time?" Celeste felt something inside her twist. She had always known this was coming. The moment people saw what she could do, they always looked at her differently. Jack didn't look away from Rust. "She didn't fry the ship," Jack said simply. "She saved us." Rust made a sound that wasn't quite agreement, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he turned to Celeste. "You need food. And rest. Otherwise, you're going to be useless the next time we almost die." Celeste let out a breath, a ghost of a smile flickering at the edges of her lips. "Touching." Rust rolled his eyes, but Jack caught the way his expression softened, just slightly. For someone who pretended to be heartless, Rust cared more than he let on. Celeste didn't remember falling asleep. She must have, though, because when she woke up, the ship was quiet. The faint glow of the overhead lights casting long shadows along the metal walls. She sat up slowly, her body still sore, but her mind sharper than before. And that's when she heard it. Voices. Low, quiet, coming from somewhere just outside the medbay. She stood, moving toward the doorway without making a sound. Jack and Rust were talking in the corridor. "She needs to know," Rust was saying. Jack exhaled heavily. "I know. So, tell her." Silence. Celeste's pulse quickened. Jack sighed. "I don't think she's ready." Celeste stepped into the hallway. "For what?" Jack and Rust both turned. Rust raised an eyebrow. "You were supposed to be resting." Celeste ignored him, her gaze locked on Jack. "Ready for what?" Jack hesitated, rubbing a hand down his face before finally speaking. "The Revenants," he said. "They're not just tracking you. They're tracking us." Celeste frowned. "What do you mean?" Rust crossed his arms. "I mean, your little stunt with the signal didn't just stop them from locking on. It sent a pulse. A big one." Jack nodded. "Anyone within a few systems is going to know someone just did something they weren't supposed to." Celeste felt her stomach drop. Jack ran a hand through his hair. "Which means we need to move. Fast. Celeste swallowed hard. And Nathan? Jack's expression darkened. He's coming. Silence stretched between them. Celeste took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had spent her entire life being hunted, being treated like something to be bought and sold. She wasn't going back to that. She wouldn't. She lifted her chin. Then let's stop running. Jack arched a brow. Oh? Got a plan? Celeste met his gaze, unwavering. Not yet, but I know one thing. Jack tilted his head. And what's that? Celeste's lips curled into a small, determined smile. This time, I'm fighting back. Jack studied her for a moment, then smirked. Well then, he said, pushing off the wall. Guess we'd better get ready. Rust groaned. I knew this was going to turn into a bad idea. Jack grinned. Oh, it's always been a bad idea. Aura's voice crackled over the comms. If you're done with the dramatic speeches, we have incoming. Jack clapped his hands together. Right. Time to go. Celeste followed as Jack and Rust headed toward the cockpit. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running alone. And for the first time, she wasn't running at all. She was choosing to stand, to fight, and she wasn't going to lose. Not this time. The Starfire rumbled beneath Celeste's feet as she stepped into the cockpit. The ship's engines were running hot, filling the space with a low, steady hum that felt like the heartbeat of something alive and restless. Jack was already at the controls, flipping switches with a kind of reckless confidence that shouldn't have been reassuring, but somehow was. Rust was at the weapons console, his cybernetic fingers moving fast over the displays, scanning their surroundings, and Aura, as usual, was being dramatic. Multiple incoming ships, the AI reported, her voice edged with dry amusement. I'm sure they're just here for a friendly chat. Jack let out a sharp breath. How many? 3 confirmed, more on long-range scanners. Rust swore under his breath. Nathan's bringing a whole damn squadron. Celeste felt it before she saw it. A pulse. A presence. Something shifting in the air, just at the edge of her perception, like a storm waiting to break. Then the proximity alarm blared. A shadow loomed outside the viewport, and the Revenant ships came into view, their dark hulls sleek and predatory, moving in perfect formation. They weren't trying to scare them. They were here to end this. Jack leaned back in his chair, tapping a finger against the console like he was considering his options. Well, he muttered, at least they're not being subtle. Celeste took a slow breath, forcing down the rush of adrenaline surging through her veins. Can we outrun them? Rust snorted. Not a chance. Jack tilted his head. Can we outfight them? Rust shot him a sharp look. Not unless you suddenly have a death wish. Jack grinned. I always have a death wish. Rust groaned. I hate you. Yeah, Jack said, straightening in his seat. Let's make this interesting. The ship lurched forward, thrusters firing at full capacity as Jack pulled them into a steep dive toward the asteroid belt below. Celeste braced herself, the gravity shift pressing her back against the seat. Outside the viewport, the asteroid spun in chaotic patterns, massive hunks of rock drifting through space like forgotten relics. The Revenants followed. They're locking weapons, Aura warned. Then let's make it difficult for them, Jack shot back. Rust gritted his teeth. I swear, if we survive this, I'm punching you in the face. Jack didn't respond. He was already moving, already acting, already making the kind of impossible split-second decisions that no sane person should be making. And yet, somehow, he made them work. The ship rolled sideways, dodging a blast by a fraction of a second. The impact exploded behind them, sending debris scattering through space. Celeste felt the energy in the air shifting again. This time, she didn't fight it. She let it in. A sharp intake of breath. The world tilted. And suddenly, she could see them. Not with her eyes, but with something deeper, something rawer. The ships, the pilots inside them. The way their minds moved, the way their intentions formed before their actions followed. They were predictable. Celeste didn't know how she knew that. but she did. She turned to Jack. Left. Jack didn't question it. He yanked the controls. A pulse of enemy fire shot past, narrowly missing their right thruster. Rust cursed. What the hell? Right. Upper. Now. Jack followed without hesitation. The starfire spun sharply, dodging another barrage that would have torn through their hull. Rust blinked. Is she? Jack grinned. Yeah, she is. Celeste felt something settle inside her. For the first time, she wasn't just reacting. She was controlling it. She was fighting back. Nathan's voice crackled over the comms, sharp and cold. Jack, he said, you can't win this. Jack sighed, flipping a switch. Nathan, buddy, you always say that. Because it's always true, Nathan replied. Give me the girl. Walk away. Live. Jack looked at Celeste. She met his gaze, steady, unwavering. Jack exhaled through his nose. Yeah, see, that's the thing. She's not mine to give. Nathan's voice darkened. Then you've made your choice. The comm cut off. A moment later, the Revenant ships opened fire. Jack didn't hesitate. Rust! On it! Rust unleashed a barrage of counterfire, the ship's guns roaring to life, sending bursts of energy into the void. Celeste felt the moment coming before it happened. A ship diving toward them, weapons primed, trajectory locked. She moved on instinct. Energy rushed through her veins, an electric current that was hers to command. She reached out. Not with her hands, but with her mind. The enemy ship stalled, just for a second, just long enough. Jack took the shot. The Revenant ship erupted into flames. The explosion sent a shockwave through the battlefield, scattering debris, forcing the other ships to break formation. Celeste staggered, her vision swimming. But Jack was already moving, already pulling them away, already flying them toward freedom. The Revenants hesitated. For the first time, they hesitated. Jack didn't waste the opportunity. Punching it! He shouted. The starfire shot forward, engines flaring as they pushed past the chaos, past the danger, past everything that had been trying to drag them down. Nathan's voice crackled over the comm one last time. You can't run forever. Jack smirked, flipping the comm switch off. Watch me. The silence that followed was deafening. Celeste slumped back into her seat, breathing hard. Jack exhaled, running a hand down his face. Rust let out a low whistle. Well, that was awful. Jack grinned, turning to Celeste. You good? She thought about that. She was exhausted. Her body ached. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she had chosen this, like she had fought for something that was hers. She met Jack's gaze. Yeah, she said. I'm good. Jack nodded, satisfied. Rust rolled his eyes. Great. Now someone get me a damn drink. Aura crackled over the comms. Captain, you have 14 overdue payments and a cargo hold full of regrets. Jack groaned. Yeah. Add it to the list. Celeste let herself smile. For the first time, she wasn't running. She was free, and she had no intention of ever going back. At its core, Stolen Stars is more than just a science fiction adventure. It is a story about identity, freedom, and the power of choice. Celeste begins her journey as a captive, someone who has been told what she is worth, and where she belongs. She has been bought, sold, and discarded, treated as nothing more than a commodity. But through her journey with Jack, Rust, and Aura, she discovers something more powerful than the abilities hidden within her. The right to define herself. The story highlights the deep human need for connection and trust. Celeste has every reason to be skeptical, every reason to expect betrayal. Yet Jack does something that no one else has ever done. He gives her the freedom to choose. He never asks her for anything in return, never demands loyalty or obedience. Instead, he offers trust, respect, and a place where she is more than just a number. Through Jack's actions, we see that heroism is not about grand gestures or self-sacrifice, but about simple, meaningful choices. It is about standing by someone when they have no reason to believe in you. It is about choosing to fight, not because you have to, but because someone else deserves to be fought for. Ultimately, Stolen Stars is a story about finding one's own worth. Celeste was never meant to exist, at least not according to those who tried to control her. But by the end, she chooses to live not as someone's experiment, not as a weapon, but as herself. And that, more than anything, is what true freedom means. Across the galaxies, across time itself. You've found your way here. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the universe our community reaches. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the unknown. You won't want to miss it.